The snow, having arrived in the night with the diffident thoroughness characteristic of respectable weather, lay in a clean, resigned sheet over Flaxborough. It muffled the pavements, blurred the more ambitious potholes, and gave a certain charitable softness to buildings which in summer could only be described as municipal. By 10 o'clock the parish procession had assembled, less from religious fervour than from an ingrained sense that anything bearing the word parish was not quite optional. Churchwardens, sidesmen, committee ladies, and a sprinkling of the elderly poor, conspicuously wrapped in donated scarves, arranged themselves in a column of chilly piety. At its head stood Mrs. Lydia Carstone, treasurer of the parish snow relief fund, in a fur-lined coat which announced, with tactful firmness, that charity began comfortably at home. She surveyed the assembled ranks with the air of one to whom gratitude was both familiar and faintly overdue. The vicar, Reverend Poole, fussed beside her, rearranging his scarf with the helpless fingers of a man who found wool more difficult than theology. Behind them, a brass cross of uncertain stability trembled in the hands of a boy from the choir who was old enough to be cynical, but not yet old enough to be excused. The line extended back along the church path, past the Lich Gate and out into the High Street, where shopkeepers, prepared for the event by the Flaxborough Chronicle, had adopted expressions of reverent boredom. It was not often, they reflected, that civic conscience brought customers so conveniently past their windows. At the rear of the small crowd that had gathered along the pavement, Inspector Purbright watched with a detached curiosity that he would have denied was professional. He was there, ostensibly, to assist with the marshalling of traffic, though the only vehicle in immediate evidence was Sergeant Love's police car, parked at an angle which suggested both authority and reluctance to skid. The procession began to move with the funereal caution of people testing unfamiliar snow in unsuitable footwear. A hymn emerged from the company, faint and exploratory, as though the words had been mislaid somewhere between the vestry and the first lamp-post. Purbright, hands in his overcoat pockets, walked slowly along the opposite pavement, where cold brick fronts leaned inward like conspirators. Mrs. Carstone led them towards the war memorial in the market square, the ordained terminus of their wintry duty. Each year, the snow procession concluded with prayers for the vulnerable in conditions of inclement weather, a phrase which appeared to include everyone except Mrs. Carstone. She walked with that particular briskness of the comfortably shod, her breath forming discreet little clouds of influence in the frosty air. Behind her, the committee members kept pace with varying degrees of conviction. Mr. Bransom, retired draper and assistant treasurer, stared at her back with an expression combining admiration and mild alarm. Mrs. Lilling, chairwoman, moved as if afraid of appearing either too eager or insufficiently stricken by the elements. The elderly poor, their scarves bearing tags from last year's appeal, shuffled on with the patient curiosity of those accustomed to being processed rather than consulted. At the memorial, the company arranged itself in a rough semicircle around the snow-fringed plinth and its list of names, which time and civic repainting had rendered curiously democratic. The vicar cleared his throat in a way that suggested both devotion and a recent chest infection. Prayers were offered with reasonable efficiency. Nobody, Purbright noticed, lingered over the parts concerning those without shelter. The snow continued its unassuming descent, settling in the crevices of carved stone soldiers and on Mrs. Carstone's hat, which refused to acknowledge it. When the time came, she stepped forward, knelt on the cleared stone platform with practiced solemnity, and bowed her head. There was a conscious hush, the silence of people simultaneously worshipping and wondering when they could go back indoors. It was the choir boy, nervously shifting the cross from one chilly hand to the other, who first appeared to notice that the silence had outlasted its devotional justification. Mrs. Carstone remained kneeling, her head still bowed, the fur collar of her coat presenting a luxurious barrier to interpretation. The vicar murmured her name once, then again, with the awkwardness of a man addressing someone who outranked him socially even in a state of possible medical emergency. When she did not respond, there occurred among the committee members a small movement, less a rush than a collective adjusting. Mr. Bransom took half a step forward, and then, remembering his place in several senses, half a step back. It was left to the verger to bend down and touch her shoulder, doing so with the exaggerated delicacy of a man approaching a familiar but temperamental boiler. The subsequent flurry of activity was dignified rather than dramatic, as if everyone involved had tacitly agreed that public alarm would be unseemly in a parish with so much to lose by it. Mrs. Carstone was eased onto her back with the assistance of two sidesmen, and an elderly refugee from the choir stalls who claimed vague experience of first aid in the war. Her face, usually set in lines of managerial goodwill, had acquired a fixed serenity that owed nothing to voluntary piety. Someone was sent, or permitted, to run for Dr. Hilliard, who bed from his nearby surgery, with the particular briskness of a man whose patients usually insisted on not dying until after surgery hours. He knelt, produced a stethoscope from a pocket that also contained, somewhat incongruously, a packet of mints, and conducted an examination which took scarcely longer than politeness required. "A heart," he said at last, in a tone that managed to be both authoritative and apologetic. Quite sudden, I should say, though not perhaps altogether unexpected. This remark, dropped like a pebble into the pool of committee sensibilities, produced the faintest inward ripple of collective alarm. The vicar murmured something about the inscrutability of Providence. Mrs. Lilling clasped her gloves with visible concentration, as though they contained the right words if only she could squeeze hard enough. Nobody asked what was meant by not perhaps altogether unexpected. It was early yet for questions, and there were reputations present that required time to arrange suitable expressions of shock. Purbright, having offered to help only in ways that would not interfere with anything, observed the maneuvers with professional detachment and a private curiosity. Death in Flaxborough seldom arrived in public, and almost never in such carefully curated surroundings. The snow, indifferent to both ceremony and casualty, continued to drift down, settling on the dark cloth hastily thrown over Mrs. Carstone's figure. Committee members gathered in small groups, their discussions conducted in tones of subdued compassion that did little to conceal an underlying agitation. There was much talk of poor Lydia and her tireless work for the fund, phrases that came easily to lips accustomed to minutes and motions. Purbright noted that very few of these reflections referred to her as a person rather than an institution. It was Sergeant Love who, later, as the Procession dissolved into separate, hurrying individuals, mentioned the recent letters. "Anonymous, sir," he said, his breath forming small astonished clouds as they stood by the police car. Well, not signed anyway. All about parish charities, suggesting that something wasn't, entirely on the up and up. Purbright regarded the snowbanks edging the square, which the council gritter had transformed into something approximating grey suet. Anonymous letters and charitable funds, he reflected, frequently enjoyed an unsatisfactory proximity. He asked Love, with mild interest, to locate the correspondence when convenient. The inspector's gaze returned to the memorial, where the snow was already softening the outline of the hastily abandoned kneeling cushion. It struck him that there were an unusual number of people crossing the square who seemed determined not to look in that direction at all. By late afternoon, the snow had settled into the sort of damp, resigned slush that discouraged heroism and rewarded indoor duty. The Parish Relief Committee, having endured both the elements and the departure of its treasurer, reassembled in the church hall with the obedient punctuality of people who suspected that absence might be taken for guilt. The hall, never an inspiring room, had achieved a new level of penitential chill. Its high windows admitted a grey light that rendered the portraits of past rectors wan and slightly accusatory. A long table, covered in a cloth that had seen better committees, dominated the centre. At its head sat Mrs. Dorothea Lilling, chairwoman, her hat still firmly on, as if to concede that things were grave but not yet disordered. "Thank you for coming at such short notice," she began, in a voice that suggested she held the parish responsible for its own inconvenience. "We are all, I am sure, deeply affected by the sad events of this morning." There was a murmur of agreement, earnest in its way, though more confident on the subject of events than of sadness. Mr. Percival Bransom, appointed assistant treasurer in a moment of weakness some years before, sat 2 places down, his fingers intertwined on the table as though seeking collective courage. Miss Edith Parlow, secretary, had placed before her a minute book whose blank page waited with quiet menace. It was into this moderately charged atmosphere that Inspector Purbright allowed himself to be introduced. He remained standing, coat unbuttoned but still worn, as if to indicate that his presence was officially provisional. "We are most grateful, Inspector, that you could attend," Mrs. Lilling said, the words hovering between welcome and inquiry. "In these exceptional circumstances, it seemed advisable that there be, as it were, clarity." "I am entirely at your service," Purbright replied, "though my contribution may consist largely in listening, which I define as the cheapest form of clarity." The attempt at humour passed safely over the committee, who were in no condition to recognize economy in any form. Miss Parlow poised her pencil with grim dedication. "We have lost," Mrs. Lilling resumed, "not only a valued colleague but the guiding hand of our principal charitable undertaking. The Parish Snow Relief Fund has depended for many years upon Mrs. Carstone's meticulous attention." "Quite meticulous," Bransom murmured, rather too quickly. "Everything in order, always in order." "Yes, thank you, Mr. Bransom," she replied. "Which is why, Inspector, we felt it appropriate that you be informed, informally of course, that the fund, while entirely sound, now finds itself temporarily unguided." Purbright inclined his head. "You wish perhaps to ensure that Mrs. Carstone's death could not be misconstrued in any way that might reflect upon the fund." There was a silence, in which the humming of the hall's ancient radiators appeared suddenly very noticeable. "We would not, naturally, wish her devoted work to be misinterpreted," Mrs. Lilling said at last. "People are inclined, in times of shock, to indulge in speculative thinking. I feel sure you encounter such tendencies." "From time to time," Purbright allowed, "though usually where there has been more excitement than a memorial service." He let the pause grow just long enough. "There is, you see, a small administrative matter," Bransom put in, the words escaping as though they had been jostling one another for precedence. "Purely procedural, naturally. But in view of what has happened this morning, it seemed best that no one should say we had acted precipitately." Miss Parlow glanced up from the minute book, as if uncertain how to spell the accusation they were seeking to forestall. "The accounts," Mrs. Lilling said carefully, "are entirely correct. Of that I have no doubt. Lydia was a woman of principle, if occasionally firm. However, she did rather insist upon maintaining the ledgers in her own hand." "She kept them at home?" Purbright asked mildly. "Yes," Bransom replied, almost gratefully. "That is to say, the working papers. The formal balances, of course, are presented annually. Quite properly. I sign them myself. Countersign," he added, as if the distinction improved matters. "And you have these working papers?" "Not as such," he admitted. "Lydia was to bring everything next week. We had arranged a preliminary review." "An internal audit," suggested Purbright. "A friendly one," corrected Mrs. Lilling, with a glance that discouraged elaboration. The inspector moved nearer the table, running a gloved finger along a small ridge in the worn cloth, as if considering whether it deserved investigation. "I ask only," he said, "because Sergeant Love mentioned that certain anonymous letters have reached the station. They referred, rather imprecisely, to winter charities. It occurred to me that some reassurance might be welcome in both directions." Bransom's fingers tightened. Miss Parlow's pencil hesitated on the blank page. "Anonymous letters are, I think, a feature of all settled communities," Mrs. Lilling remarked. "They provide a harmless outlet for disappointment. I should be extremely reluctant to dignify them with the term information." "Entirely understandable," Purbright agreed. "One learns to distinguish between malice and relevance. Still, such letters tend not to appear without some prompting circumstance, however trivial." "Trivial, I feel sure, is the appropriate word," she said. "Lydia was occasionally abrupt in declining applications for assistance. One can imagine, perhaps, that some individual felt aggrieved. It is easier to suspect dishonesty when one has been denied 6 bags of coal," Bransom added. "Human nature, Inspector." "Indeed," Purbright said. "And the Snow Fund, its disbursements are decided by the committee as a whole?" "In principle," Mrs. Lilling replied. "In practice? Well," she conceded, "Lydia was remarkably efficient in sifting applications. It would have been wasteful to duplicate her efforts. She would bring to us those cases she deemed appropriate," Bransom explained. "Naturally, we could not review every small matter. We are all volunteers." "Naturally," Purbright repeated. He let his gaze travel around the hall, the stacked chairs, the curling notice announcing a whist drive postponed indefinitely, the chart of diocesan giving, where Flaxborough's modest contribution lurked near the bottom with respectable shame. "May I ask," he continued, "whether Mrs. Carstone had expressed any concern about her health before this morning?" There was another of those pauses that suggested private recollection. Hurriedly consulting public prudence, "She was perhaps a little more fatigued of late," Mrs. Lilling allowed. "We urged her to delegate. She preferred, I think, to maintain personal responsibility. She did seem," Bransom said slowly, "rather preoccupied during the last 2 meetings. At the time I assumed she was considering investment matters. She had mentioned some London advice, perfectly proper of course, seeking better returns for the beneficiaries." "London advice?" Purbright asked. A financial consultant, he explained. Recommended by a distant cousin, I believe. There was some discussion of moving a portion of the fund into something or other. She used terms with which I am not familiar. It has become quite a field. Did she name this consultant? There was a fractional hesitation that only a very patient observer would have noticed. I am almost sure she did, Bransom answered. Though at the moment the name escapes me. Lydia was fond of names. She enjoyed producing them at meetings. We felt, Mrs. Lilling said quickly, that any such decisions must be ratified by the committee. There was to be no question of unilateral action. Naturally, Purbright agreed again, the word acquiring a certain private curvature. He closed his notebook with a small final sound. Thank you. You have been most helpful. I shall in due course request access to the formal accounts, purely as a precaution. Sudden deaths, even from natural causes, tend to attract speculation. It is sometimes best to be seen as having nothing to conceal. Quite, said Mrs. Lilling, with more emphasis than gratitude. I am sure we all wish nothing more than to preserve Lydia's legacy. Miss Parlow finally wrote something in the minute book. A careful script formed, under the date, the words, Chairwoman expressed committee's profound regret. After a short pause, she added, Inspect, or in attendance, observing. As the meeting broke up into polite knots of whispered reassurance, Purbright allowed his gaze to rest briefly on the open page. Miss Parlow, noticing his interest, closed the book with unnecessary speed. It was, he reflected as he stepped back into the thinning snow, a curious thing that in a committee, so determined upon transparency, the only record of their most anxious discussion should be a single line, hastily concluded. He wondered, not for the first time that day, whether the real omissions would be found in the official ledgers, or in what none of them had yet felt able to put into writing. Mrs. Lydia Carstone's cottage stood in a row of those habitations which give the impression of having been designed by a man who thought sentiment could be achieved by reducing ceiling height. The small front garden, now under a respectably modest quilt of snow, managed even in winter to suggest disapproval of casual callers. Inspector Purbright, approaching with Sergeant Love, had the mild sensation of intruding upon someone else's carefully arranged solitude. Miss Cynthia Carstone opened the door with the promptness of one who had been waiting for someone, though not specifically for them. She was a narrower, paler echo of her late sister, her hair arranged in the kind of uncompromising bun that implies either strong principles or poor eyesight. Her expression, on recognizing the inspector, achieved politeness with obvious effort. I suppose, she said, standing aside with rigid courtesy, you will wish to see Lydia's papers. People always do when the body is scarcely cold. That is very considerate of you, Miss Carstone, Purbright replied, stepping into an atmosphere that combined floral air freshener with a suggestion of proprietary disinfectant. We are merely anxious to avoid administrative confusion. Sudden deaths are notoriously considerate about their paperwork. The sitting room was a monument to controlled respectability. Every surface bore evidence of having been wiped more often than touched. Ornamental plates, commemorating distant coronations, marched along the mantel in rigid formation. Only the bureau in the corner suggested real occupation. It had the slightly swollen look of a piece of furniture that knew too much. Miss Carstone offered chairs with the air of a woman distributing limited resources. She declined to sit herself, preferring a position by the fireplace where she could both supervise and, if necessary, defend. Her hands, folded neatly, were clasped just tightly enough to indicate that politeness in this household was rarely spontaneous. You and your sister lived here alone? Purbright asked, his tone conversational. For the last 18 years, she replied. Lydia believed that shared domestic arrangements promoted economy and moral support. I contributed half the household expenses from my annuity, and she devoted the rest of her energies to the parish. And to the fund, of course. Sergeant Love, occupying the edge of his chair with conscious care, glanced toward the bureau. The gesture did not escape Miss Carstone. You may examine her papers, she said, with the weary resignation of one accepting a social obligation likely to prove expensive. Lydia was most particular about her accounts. You will find everything in order. She would have insisted upon that much, I think. Whatever else may have been disorderly. The inspector looked up. Whatever else, Miss Carstone hesitated. It was the pause rather than any subsequent remark which supplied information. My sister had been troubled of late. Not in her duties, you understand. In those she remained mercilessly efficient. But her mind was occupied by parish matters, Purbright asked. And others, she replied. There were telephone calls. From London, she said. Investments connected with the fund. She spoke of consultations and opportunities, words which never sat comfortably in her mouth. Lydia preferred certainties. Purbright asked if they might see the bureau. Miss Carstone produced a key from the chain at her waist with a small metallic sigh, like a minor concession to an occupying force. The top drawer opened obediently, revealing an array of files labelled in Lydia's precise, uncompromising hand. The Snow Fund ledger occupied the central position, its binding showing the particular gloss acquired through frequent, anxious handling. Love placed it carefully on the table. The pages, when turned, revealed double columns of figures marching with depressing regularity through winters past. Impressive, Love murmured. Very tidy, Purbright repeated. An interesting word. I sometimes find that where money and morality intersect, excessive tidiness can be as revealing as chaos. He bent closer. The entries were neat, the handwriting unwavering. Assistance to Widow Cartwright, coal voucher, Mr. Henson, winter clothing allowance, Mrs. Phipps, emergency heating grant. All documented, countersigned, and totalled with the tidy zeal of a woman who believed that good works benefited from accountancy. Yet here and there, faintly visible beneath the ink, the ghost of pencil calculations lingered. Small sums had been jotted in the margins and later rubbed away, leaving smudges just discernible in the right light. Your sister checked her figures frequently? Purbright asked casually. Obsessively, Miss Carstone replied. She was afraid of making mistakes. She believed mistakes in charitable works were a form of moral embezzlement. I found that view rigorous. Purbright traced one of the erased marks with a finger. The smudge corresponded to an entry for a Mrs. C.E. Leah Gorman, winter hardship assistance. The amount was appreciably larger than those surrounding it. Mrs. Gorman, he inquired. Not a familiar name in Flaxborough. Nor to me, Miss Carstone said. Lydia mentioned once that some recipients were parish-adjacent cases, people previously resident or with relatives here. She had begun to widen the fund's scope. Christian responsibility, she said, was not confined to the parish boundary. One admires such breadth, Purbright murmured, particularly when exercised by someone known for narrowness. He continued turning the pages. Other entries bore the same recipient's name, interspersed among more conventional beneficiaries. The associated pencil smudges appeared with quietly increasing frequency. It suggested a hand that had hesitated, recalculated, and then committed itself with newfound resolve. In recent weeks, he asked, "Did your sister discuss any difficulty relating to the fund?" Miss Carstone's lips compressed, as though containing something uncivil. She spoke of being compromised, Inspector, not in the vulgar sense, naturally. Lydia's notions of impropriety were entirely financial and reputational. She said someone knew of a small irregularity she had committed for a good purpose, and that this person was extracting advantage. Those were her words. Love shifted. Blackmail, miss? I prefer Lydia's term, she said firmly. It sounds less like a newspaper and more like a problem to be solved. Purbright closed the ledger gently. And the irregularity? She did not share the details. She said I was better placed not to know. Lydia believed information was like money, dangerous in the wrong hands, and often in the right ones. There was a small silence. The clock on the mantel contributed 16 measured ticks before anyone spoke. You mentioned London calls, Purbright said. Do you happen to recall? The name of her consultant, Miss Carstone considered. Gorman, I believe. She once told me that Mrs. Gorman, the same name as in the ledger, you see, was married to a financial gentleman in the city. He advised on investment vehicles, a phrase Lydia pronounced as one might speak of suspicious foreigners. Purbright permitted himself a private reflection that suspicious foreigners were often less dangerous to parish funds than familiar Englishmen in good suits. Aloud, he merely asked, "Did these calls seem to distress her?" "They fatigued her," Miss Carstone replied. Afterwards she would sit very still and say that certain wheels, once set in motion, could no longer be stopped without a crash. Lydia had developed a sudden fluency in metaphor. Love glanced toward a small writing desk beneath the window. Would your sister have kept correspondence from this Mr. Gorman? Miss Carstone followed his gaze. For the first time, real uncertainty flitted across her face. There is a folder. She labeled it Consultations. I have not opened it. Lydia said that if anything happened to her, I was to burn it immediately. It did not occur to me she might choose the war memorial as the moment for such instructions to become relevant. Yet you have not burned it, Purbright observed. I am not Lydia, she replied quietly. I prefer to know what sins I am expected to atone for before committing myself to the flames. The folder, when produced, was of the stiff, businesslike variety that suggested serious contents and no poetry. Its fastener, however, remained unbroken. I should like, Purbright said gently, to take charge of this for the present. There may be matters which, if properly addressed, could spare the fund and your sister's reputation. Unnecessary speculation. Miss Carstone regarded the folder as though it contained an unpleasant inheritance. Speculation is the modern form of gossip, Inspector. Lydia feared both. If taking that will prevent either, you may do so. As they left, the winter light had thinned to that particular grey which makes even honest houses appear to have secrets. Love, crunching along the path, ventured a cautious observation. Do you think she truly meant to burn it, sir? I think, Purbright replied, watching the small figure of Miss Carstone reappear briefly at the window before withdrawing the curtain, that Lydia intended many things she never quite achieved, including, perhaps, confessing exactly how Peter had been used to satisfy Paul. He weighed the folder in his hand. It was not especially heavy, but there was a density to it all the same, as though paper could accumulate gravity when enough reputations depended on its contents. Curious, isn't it, he added, how a woman so exact about figures could be so imprecise about her own threshold for dishonor. Love nodded, though whether in agreement or in comprehension was not entirely clear. Behind them, in the disciplined quiet of the cottage, the bureau drawer remained slightly ajar, just enough to reveal the corner of a second ledger, thinner, unlabeled, and not yet noticed by anyone at all. The London number, traced with the reluctant cooperation of the telephone exchange, belonged to the offices of Gorman, Price and Allerton, financial consultants, Bloomsbury. The firm's headed notepaper, obligingly supplied by an understimulated clerk, depicted 3 interlocking initials that suggested a union rather more harmonious than its partners apparently enjoyed. Inspector Purbright studied the letterhead with the distant interest of a man examining a stranger's family portrait. The name Felix H. Gorman, managing director, appeared in the lower C. Orner, modestly sized yet somehow obtrusive. It was the name that had punctuated Mrs. Carstone's last weeks with expensive telephone calls and, quite possibly, cheaper reassurances. Consultants, remarked Purbright, laying the paper on his desk, are rather like dentists, Love. One expects discomfort, but not actual blood. Sergeant Love, who regarded most financial instruments with the awe he reserved for explosives, nodded respectfully. You'll be going up to see him, sir? Merely to satisfy curiosity, Purbright replied. The dead have so few opportunities to explain themselves, it seems only fair to trouble the living instead. London received Purbright with its usual mixture of indifference and overcharging. Gorman, Price and Allerton occupied 2 rooms and an attitude on the 3rd floor of a terraced building whose facade suggested barristers' chambers and whose staircase implied servants' access. A typist of such resolute prettiness that it almost counted as a professional qualification announced him with reluctance over an internal telephone. Inspector Purbright, from Flaxworth? A pause followed, filled by the faint crackle of distant calculation. Mr. Gorman will see you, she concluded at last, as though reporting a verdict of not proven. Felix Gorman rose from behind his desk, with the practiced ease of a man accustomed to making bad news sound like expert advice. He was of middle height, but had arranged his hair and waistcoat so as to suggest superiority in both departments. Inspector Purbright, he said warmly, do sit down. I trust there is no difficulty, shall we say, with our mutual late acquaintance. Our difficulty, replied Purbright, accepting a chair that had been chosen to confer no advantage of height, is principally that she is late. The dead are inclined to create administrative inconvenience. Quite, Gorman agreed. I was extremely show. Seek to hear of Mrs. Carstone's sudden collapse. One does not expect country benefactors to expire in mid-procession. How may I assist? Perhaps, suggested Purbright, by explaining the nature of your business relationship. Gorman's smile widened by the few millimeters available to it. Entirely proper, I assure you. I provide specialist advice to a number of charitable trusts seeking modest but dependable returns. Mrs. Carstone consulted me about placing a small portion of the snow fund in gilt-edged securities. A most prudent notion, cut tragically short, and the frequent telephone conversations. Routine reassurances, Inspector. Markets fluctuate, Vickers panic. I merely assisted Mrs. Carstone in maintaining a tranquil perspective. His hands, resting on the blotter, remained commendably still. Only the gold signet ring tapped, almost inaudibly, against the leather. Purbright produced a folded sheet from his pocket with the mild reluctance of someone obliged to introduce a vulgar topic to polite company. You may be interested to know that, in Flaxborough, anonymous letters fluctuate rather more vigorously than markets. One recent correspondent suggested that certain winter charities were becoming unexpectedly generous to addresses in London. A crank, Gorman said promptly. Small towns breed them as surely as they breed committees. I have no doubt your good lady treasurer attracted envy. Envy, said Purbright, is frequently attracted toward those whose generosity appears selective. He glanced at the paper. You know, for example, a Mrs. Celia Gorman? The consultant's expression did not quite alter, it merely became a more careful version of itself. My wife, he said, though separated. Why? Because, replied Purbright, the Snow Fund's records show 3 payments to a Mrs. C. Gorman over the past 2 years, each described as winter hardship assistance. The total would, I think, purchase a satisfactory quantity of hardship in Flaxborough. Gorman allowed himself a soft laugh that had clearly seen previous service. My wife, Inspector, insisted on maintaining a small antiques business in your town some while ago. Its fortunes fluctuated even more erratically than our marriage. Mrs. Carstone, as I understood it, extended temporary relief to a struggling trader, an admirable instance of Christian kindness. Indeed, Purbright conceded, Christian kindness can be remarkably precise in its selection of beneficiaries, particularly when guided perhaps by professional advice from Bloomsbury. I must reject any such implication, Gorman said, still courteous but slightly less upholstered. My suggestions to Mrs. Carstone were strictly related to investments, never to distributions. If she chose to help my wife, it was without my knowledge, though naturally I cannot prevent you drawing whatever provincial inferences amuse you. The inspector did not appear amused. The payments to your wife, he said mildly, coincide neatly with sums withdrawn from the fund but not immediately reflected in your investment statements. One might almost suppose a delicate process of substitution. Charities, Gorman replied, are messy things on paper. Collections in tins, pledges in envelopes, bequests in unprobated wills. I have advised enough of them to know that apparent discrepancies often result from nothing more sinister than amateur bookkeeping. Possibly, Purbright said. Yet in this instance the amateur bookkeeper maintained accounts that would not shame a bank, except of course for the erased pencilings. He regarded Gorman thoughtfully. Tell me, did you ever threaten to report Mrs. Carstone to her committee? Threaten, Gorman repeated, outraged on a modest scale. I am a financial advisor, not a blackmailer. I did not. Use that word, said Purbright, though I see it occurs readily to you. Their interview concluded, as such interviews do, in a flurry of politeness designed to conceal that nothing had been admitted and much had been understood. Gorman accompanied him to the door with almost filial courtesy. If there is any documentation you wish to inspect, he said, our files are at your disposal, within the bounds of client confidentiality. Naturally, confidentiality, observed Purbright, tends to be at its strictest when it would prove most enlightening. Back in Flaxborough, the station's comparative quiet possessed an almost monastic quality after London's polite bustle. Sergeant Love looked up from a list of names with the bleak satisfaction of a man whose suspicions had successfully bred more work. Been through the Snow Fund beneficiaries, sir. Quite a collection. Several, you might say, are surprising choices for winter relief. In what way surprising? Well, sir, Mrs. Pratt of the High Street appears to have received coal money 3 years running. She also owns a motor car and her nephew's betting shop. And there's a Mr. Hopkins, builder, who somehow qualified for assistance while renovating half the vestry roof at market rates. Generosity, murmured Purbright, seems to have followed curious paths. He removed his coat and laid Gorman's card on the desk, as though introducing a new suspect to the company. Any sign among these names of our London acquaintance? Love consulted the list. No other Gorman, sir. But there are 2 or 3 addresses outside the parish. One's down as temporary residence in London. Amount rather larger than average. Ah, said Purbright. Charity broadens its mind as well as its geography. He took from his pocket the manila folder labelled Consultations. F. Gorman, and opened it with the caution of someone expecting something unpleaser. And to lie alive. Inside were neatly typed summaries of telephone conversations, each dated, each bearing figures in the margin in Lydia Carstone's precise hand. Phrases recurred with depressing regularity. Further remittance, discretion essential, committee not yet apprised. One note, underlined twice, read, "Cannot divert additional sums without drawing attention. Suggest alternative arrangement." FG insistent. Love waited, patient as a junior curate, while the inspector turned the pages. "Anything helpful, sir?" "Possibly." Purbright closed the folder gently. "It appears Mrs. Carstone was attempting to conduct two kinds of stewardship at once, financial and reputational. The strain, I imagine, was considerable." He crossed to the map pinned to the far wall, where pins in fading colors recorded events long since forgotten. For a moment he regarded the parish boundary as though it were a moral frontier. "Love," he said at length, "have we any information about Reverend Poole's son? The one who works, or worked, in London?" "Timothy, sir. Only what's common talk. Bank job. Came home rather suddenly last year and then went back again." "Something about a misunderstanding with figures," Mrs. Pratt said. Purbright's gaze returned to the manila folder. "Flaxborough appears to specialize in misunderstandings with figures. Some of them, I suspect, add up rather accurately." He slid Gorman's card beneath a paperweight, an act that might have passed for absent-minded tidying but which, in the station's quiet, possessed the finality of a small decision. Outside, the snow that remained from the procession was thinning into a greyish slush, revealing beneath its retreat the ordinary blemishes of the pavement. It occurred to Purbright that the Snow Fund, viewed with less devotional reverence, might be undergoing a similar seasonal adjustment. What remained unclear as he penned the bishop's unsent letter and read again the unfinished sentence about irregularities, was precisely which of the town's pieties Mrs. Carstone had finally ceased to believe in: the benevolence of London advisers, the discretion of her fellow committee members, or the forgiving memory of Flaxborough itself. Reverend Poole's vicarage gave the impression of having been furnished by an industrious but absent-minded aunt. The drawing-room was full of small tables, all doing nothing of consequence, and bookcases stacked with volumes that had been carefully opened at least once. It was into this atmosphere of respectable muddle that Inspector Purbright allowed himself to be shown on a grey Tuesday afternoon. The Reverend himself entered with the weary briskness of a man who had spent the morning composing a sermon about Christian fortitude, while personally doubting its practical application. He greeted Purbright with hands that were both welcoming and defensive, as though anxious to demonstrate cooperation while reserving the right to moral disapproval. "My housekeeper mentioned you wished to discuss parish business, Inspector," he began, lowering himself into an armchair that had clearly been tracking his descent over several years. "I confess I had imagined our next meeting might be at the inquest. I thought it best not to wait for official occasions," Purbright replied. "Matters of conscience and accountancy often benefit from earlier conversations." Poole winced faintly at the coupling. "You refer, I presume, to poor Mrs. Carstone and the fund?" "Indirectly," Purbright said. "More precisely to the draft letter she wrote to the bishop 3 days before her death." The Reverend's fingers tightened on the armrests. "Ah, you have seen it." Her sister felt there was little point in preserving the confidence of the deceased when the subject was the spiritual integrity of the living, Purbright observed. Mrs. Carstone appeared to be preparing to report irregularities in the administration of parish charitable funds, an unfortunate phrase in a town so attached to its reputation for sober probity. Poole stared at the fire, which responded with a small, dispirited crackle. "Yes," he said slowly. "She brought the draft to me. Asked whether I believed it her duty to send it." "And did you?" Purbright inquired. "I advised caution," Poole admitted. "Perhaps excessively. Lydia was not a woman accustomed to shades of obligation. She preferred black and white, particularly when drawing up minutes. But this matter was complicated." "Involving your own family," Purbright suggested gently. There was no start of surprise, only a kind of sagging acknowledgement. "You have discovered that much." "We have discovered," Purbright said, "that certain notations in her private calculations correspond to transfers not recorded in the Snow Fund ledger. The name Timothy appears beside one of these. I assumed it did not refer to the epistle." Poole gave a brief humorless smile. "Quite so. My son has been the subject of various epistles, few of them canonical." He rose and crossed to the writing desk, opening a drawer with the careful reluctance of someone unsealing his own indictment. From it he took a narrow folder, held together with an elastic band that had given up hope. "I had intended to burn these," he said. "It seems I am not, in such matters, as decisive as Lydia." Inside, Purbright found a series of letters on cream notepaper, printed with the crest of a London bank more distinguished than its moral climate. The phrasing was vigorously circumlocutory, but the message emerged. Mr. Timothy Poole had been given the opportunity to resign after an incident involving unauthorized access to client funds, a minor misunderstanding. Purbright suggested. In financial circles, Poole replied, resuming his seat with visible care. All misunderstandings are minor until someone insists on understanding them fully. Tim took a sum, a modest sum, you understand, from an inactive account. He was certain he could replace it before any discrepancy was noticed. An optimism which, I need hardly add, proved unfounded. The amount, £400, Poole said quietly. Enormous to us, trivial to the bank, catastrophic to my son's career, and to Lydia Carstone's heart, Purbright said. Poole closed his eyes briefly. He came to me here, in this room, white-faced and talking of exile, disgrace, the end of all prospects. I had almost come to accept that such outbursts were Tim's preferred method of communication. This time, however, the panic was genuine. So you approached Mrs. Carstone. Not at once, Poole corrected. One does not rush to expose one's son's folly to a committee colleague who has spent 12 years balancing accounts with missionary zeal. I attempted to raise the sum myself. My private resources proved unequal to paternal devotion. Clergy pensions seldom anticipate the need to subsidize amateur embezzlement, Purbright observed. Quite. A faint, rueful smile appeared and vanished. In the end, I confided in Lydia. Or rather, I confessed. She listened with that terrifying stillness of hers. Then she said, we must preserve both Timothy and the fund, one sin at a time. Commendable, if selective, piety. She proposed a temporary loan from the Snow Fund, Poole said. The money would be replaced, within the year, through what she called adjustments to discretionary disbursements. We would tell no one. The bank would be placated, Timothy spared scandal, the fund ultimately restored. I allowed myself to believe in the arithmetic of mercy. Did Timothy know the source of his salvation? Not initially, Poole admitted. He believed an anonymous benefactor had intervened. Later, his gratitude took the form of renewed optimism. I explained that his reprieve came at the expense of a woman whose health and peace of mind could ill afford such generosity. He was appalled. Briefly. And the replacement of funds? Did it proceed? Partial repayments were made, Poole said. Lydia reduced certain grants, delayed others, refused new applications. Her justifications were always plausible. Budgetary constraints, prior commitments. Only she and I knew the true constraint was £400 worth of silence. And then, Purbright said, Mr. Felix Gorman entered this delicate ecology. Poole's expression altered. Shock, then a certain despairing comprehension. He discovered the loan. Almost certainly. He had access to the fund's records, advised on its investments, and enjoyed the cooperation of a wife whose hardships appeared strictly financial in paperwork, but not in reality. A single irregular entry would have invited questions. Several, judiciously spaced and dressed as generosity, provided leverage. Poole looked older by several committees. She came to me again 3 weeks before the procession, said she had been compromised by kindness, that some man in London had placed a value on her mistake. She did not name him. She did not need to. How much was he extracting? She did not specify, only that each payment made the next more necessary. She spoke of being bled in shillings for the sake of £1. It was not an expression she would normally have employed. Did you advise her to go to the police? I advised her to go to the bishop, Poole said. Clergy hierarchy seemed a less frightening prospect than criminal law. She drafted the letter, brought it here. We discussed the consequences. And decided? We decided nothing, he replied. We contemplated. That is the church's preferred verb. She left with the letter in a handbag. 3 days later, she died in public worship of self-sacrifice. The fire had sunk into a sullen red geography. Outside, the vicarage garden stood in drab February resignation. After a short silence, Purbright said, You realize, Reverend, that your son's indiscretion created the first weakness Mr. Gorman appears to have exploited. Yes, Poole said simply. Timothy has always had a gift for unintended collaboration. The remark might have borne humor had it not carried such weary accuracy. Purbright rose. We shall need to speak with him. He is in London again, Poole replied. Agency work, accounts of all things. There seems no escape from his vocation. At the door, Purbright paused. "One last question, Reverend. When you and Mrs. Carstone contemplated that letter to the bishop, did she seem afraid of disgrace for herself or for the parish?" Poole considered. "For the parish," he said, utterly. Herself she regarded as already condemned. As Purbright walked back toward the station through streets that were perfectly ordinary and therefore faintly accusatory, he turned the conversation over in his mind. The pattern was familiar enough. One small dishonesty, sanctified as kindness, then layered with further compromises until the original impulse lay buried under a cairn of rationalizations. At his desk, he took out the unposted letter once more. Beneath the neat paragraph about irregularities, his eye caught, for the first time, a sentence scratched out so heavily it had almost escaped notice. "I no longer know whether I am steward of the poor or accomplice to their betters." The ink had bitten hard into the paper. It was the force rather than the words that held him. For the first time he wondered, not about what Mrs. Carstone had done, but about which of Flaxborough's worthy citizens she had finally decided were the betters in question. The vicarage of St. Luke's stood slightly back from the road, as though embarrassed by its own clerical pretensions. It had the look of a house that had long ago resigned itself to being both respectable and chronically underheated. Inspector Purbright approached along the narrow path, the winter-browned shrubs observing his progress with botanical disapproval. Reverend Poole received him in a study that combined the infirmities of theology and furniture. Books sagged in their shelves with the weary stoop of volumes too often consulted and too seldom understood. The clergyman himself rose from behind his desk with the uncertain stiffness of a man who had recently become aware of his bones. "Inspector," he said, extending a hand that was dry, cool, and faintly spectral. "You find us in some confusion, I fear. Lydia's death has created a vacuum." "Vacua," Purbright observed mildly, accepting the handshake. "I imagine her passing has removed a considerable support from several structures. Spiritual, administrative, and perhaps financial." Poole's eyelids flickered, as though at a draught. "One should be careful, Inspector, not to confuse parish structures with the church itself." "Quite," Purbright agreed. "The latter is immutable. The former depends heavily on competent treasurers." The vicar gestured to a chair whose cushions had known more sermons than upholstery. Purbright lowered himself with appropriate reverence, noting that the fire in the grate was more ornamental than warm. "You wish to speak about Lydia," Poole said. "It was not a question." "About her final weeks," Purbright replied, "and about certain pressures she appears to have been under. You were, I understand, one of the few people she approached for advice." Poole's hands, resting on the desk blotter, tightened almost imperceptibly. Lydia was troubled. That was evident. She spoke of a mistake, a financial error of judgment committed, she insisted, in the interests of Christian charity, and you advised prudence, Poole said, and prayer. "I am ordained, Inspector, not qualified as a chartered accountant, yet her difficulty lay less in arithmetic than in conscience," Purbright suggested. The Reverend regarded him with the mild caution of a man who found himself unexpectedly outflanked in his own study. She feared scandal, he conceded, not solely for herself. Lydia's own reputation would, I think, have survived almost anything. But she believed her confession would involve others who were less resilient. "Your son, Timothy," Purbright said without garnish. The silence that followed had substance. It settled on the room like an uninvited parishioner. Poole looked down at his blotter as though discovering fresh sins in its ink-stained surface. "You have spoken with Miss Carstone," he said at last. "We have," Purbright replied. "She has been frank if not comfortable. She tells us Lydia advanced your son a considerable sum when his position at the bank became, shall we say, untenable." Poole's lips moved in a brief, soundless recitation that might have been a verse or merely an attempt at structural reinforcement. "Timothy was accused of negligence," he said. "Funds misdirected, procedures not followed. There were irregularities. The bank preferred to avoid public disgrace. He resigned with a deficit unaccounted for." "A deficit," Poole confirmed. Lydia learned of it. She regarded it as an opportunity to demonstrate the practical application of Christian compassion. "Using the snow fund," Purbright said. The clergyman winced with the physicality of a man subjected to dentistry without anesthetic. "She assured me it was temporary, that prudent management would restore the sum before any audit could reveal its absence. I protested. I warned her the fund was an instrument for private redemption. And yet you allowed it." A faint flush crept up Poole's neck, as though a long-retired sense of indignation had been coaxed briefly back into circulation. "I allowed nothing," he replied. In a tone still measured but edged, Lydia informed me after the event. She made it plain that my son's survival, moral and perhaps literal, had already been purchased. One does not unbuy such things easily, Inspector. Purbright regarded him with professional neutrality. Then the blackmail began. Poole's shoulders dropped, the brief spark of resistance expired. She came to me one evening, white as the paper on which she was trying to compose her letter to the bishop. Someone had telephoned. They knew the exact amount she had taken, the date, the account numbers. They knew of Timothy. They proposed to expose her as a systematic embezzler unless she cooperated. Cooperated, Purbright repeated. By making payments, under cover of charitable disbursements, Poole said dully. She showed me one of the checks, made out to a woman in London alleged to be in distress. Lydia had taken to using that word with increasing bitterness. You advised her then to go to the authorities. He gave a brief, mirthless smile. That is to say to you, but she calculated doubtless correctly, that her confession would not be contained within the walls of your respectable station. It would seep. It would attach itself to names, to my sons among others. She asked whether it was just to sacrifice one soul for the cleansing of a parish. And what was your theological conclusion? Purbright asked. Poole studied the fire, in which two embers persisted with Anglican doggedness. I told her, he said slowly, that the truth must out. In the end, I did not insist that it do so at once in Flaxborough, and with my son as its chief exhibit. Prudence again, Bright murmured, if you wish to call it that. The clergyman's voice had settled into a flat rhythm. I call it attempting to spare an old man from seeing his son turned into a moral example. Which old man? Purbright inquired politely. Poole's gaze flicked up, startled, then unexpectedly the corner of his mouth moved. Quiet, he said. Quiet. There was a pause, during which the vicar rearranged a paperweight, a small brass cross mounted on onyx, as though it had misbehaved. When he spoke again, his voice had become more tentative. Lydia became increasingly mechanical, he said. Her visits to the vicarage were like those of a parishioner reporting on a hopeless patient. She spoke of due dates, of threats becoming more explicit. She said she woke each night wondering who would collapse first, her heart or her arrangements. She mentioned Mr. Gorman by name only once. She said, he is very smooth, very helpful, and completely without a soul, which may be an advantage in his profession. I assumed she referred to a financial consultant. I did not yet understand he had expanded his practice into spiritual asset stripping. Purbright closed his notebook. You understand, Reverend, that your son's circumstances, and his acceptance of funds he must have suspected were irregular, raise questions that may require more formal exploration. My son, Poole said carefully, has gone to stay with relatives in the north, to reflect. I suggested distance might be spiritually beneficial. A suggestion he accepted readily. Not readily, Poole said, but thoroughly. He left before Lydia died, you know. He had begun to fear that her heart would not sustain the strain. I believe he underestimated his own contribution to that strain, as young men often do when their misfortunes are being financed by others. The interview concluded with polite assurances and a handshake that felt more like a benediction withheld. As Purbright stepped back into the chill afternoon, the vicarage door closed behind him with an almost ecclesiastical finality. Walking toward the station, he considered what he had heard, a clergyman who had counselled truth in the abstract while quietly facilitating its postponement, a son whose financial disaster had been converted into a weapon, and a woman whose sense of moral order had been used to engineer her own collapse. Back in his office, he opened Mrs. Carstone's ledger again, turning to the March entries. The £3,000 withdrawal was noted in her precise hand. Beside it, in faint pencil, was a single, almost apologetic word, temporary. Purbright regarded the word for a long moment, then underlined it very gently, as though drawing attention to a promise that had never been redeemed. The following morning found Inspector Purbright in the smaller of the station's two interview rooms, a space whose dimensions and decor suggested that confessions, if obtained there, would be of the modest, embarrassed sort. Sergeant Love had laid out the snow fund ledgers, bank statements, and a selection of beneficiary forms with the solemnity of a curate preparing sacred vessels. Quite a gallery, sir, Love observed, indicating the files. Not many widows and invalids. A good number of tradesmen and shopkeepers one might describe as locally comfortable. Locally comfortable, Purbright repeated. An economic condition frequently confused with moral entitlement. He selected a file at random. Mrs. Celia Gorman. 3 payments in as many years for winter hardship. all approved personally by Mrs. Carstone, all following telephone conversations with her husband. Love nodded, and each check endorsed in the same neat hand. Cross-checked the signature with banking documents for Gorman Consultants Limited. They are, one might say, intimately acquainted. Charity, murmured Purbright, appears to be circulating in quite a closed system. The Colonel arrived precisely on time, as men who have once been paid to be punctual tend to do. Colonel Gash was the sort of retired officer whose clothes suggested both former precision and present neglect, a tweed jacket with military shoulders, cuffs slightly frayed. Tie chosen more for habit than colour. You wish to speak about my mother's bequest, he said, lowering himself into the chair with only a small grunt of resistance from his joints and a larger one from the furniture. I assume there is some administrative curiosity. Merely clarification, Purbright replied. Your late mother left a sum to the Snow Fund some 5 years ago, a substantial one, £10,000. The Colonel stated with the bluntness of artillery, intended, I was given to understand, to provide proper winter relief. Lydia assured me it would be commemorated. Plaque, brass, appropriate scriptural text. I've seen nothing more durable than a paragraph in the Parish newsletter. He produced from his pocket a folded cutting, yellowed but carefully preserved. Grateful thanks are due to an anonymous benefactor, he read with controlled irritation. Anonymous, my foot. The whole town knew it was Mother. She told most of them personally. Purbright accepted the cutting. You raised the matter with Mrs. Carstone. Repeatedly, she explained that displaying donors' names might cause awkwardness for recipients. I suggested that a discreet brass plate had never yet frozen anyone to death. She said the fund must avoid the appearance of patronage. He snorted. Patronage was precisely the point, and the money itself, transferred, Lydia told me, into longer-term instruments to provide stable income, all sounded frightfully responsible. I didn't inquire further. I'd known Lydia since she was a girl. One doesn't interrogate old acquaintances as though they were shopkeepers shorting the scale. One does not, Purbright agreed. Yet your mother's bequest no longer appears in the current statements, or rather, the capital does not. Only a much reduced balance remains. The Colonel regarded him steadily. Embezzlement, is it? I should be obliged if you would avoid using the word in front of the bridge club. They are only just recovering from the business of the doctored raffle. At present, Purbright said mildly, we are looking less at embezzlement than at a form of enforced redistribution. Mrs. Carstone appears to have been paying for silence. The Colonel's eyebrow rose with military appreciation. Blackmail, then. Nasty business. But Lydia was not a woman one. Could push about easily. She was also not a woman who could endure the thought of public disgrace. Purbright closed the file gently. Someone understood that very well. Later that afternoon, in the draughty church hall, Mrs. Lilling received Purbright with the special courtesy reserved for officials whose inquiries might become awkward if mishandled. The long trestle tables, stripped of tablecloths, gave the impression that a social function had recently departed, leaving only obligation behind. You find us in a state of transition, Inspector, she began. Lydia's death has naturally created gaps, in more than one sense, he replied. I wish to ask further about the committee's oversight of investments, particularly in relation to Mrs. Carstone's consultant, Mr. Gorman. Her lips thinned. We were aware that Lydia sought professional advice. Indeed, we encouraged it. Small-town committees are not always equipped to navigate financial markets, yet the constitution of the fund required committee approval for any change of policy. No such approval appears in the minutes. Lydia preferred not to trouble us with technicalities, Mrs. Lilling said stiffly. She believed too many cooks might compromise efficiency. Or transparency, Purbright suggested. Her eyes met his with a brief flash of resentment. Inspector, Flaxborough's charities are conducted in a spirit of Christian trust. If that trust was misapplied in this instance, I hardly see that public recrimination will improve matters. Public recrimination rarely improves anything, he agreed. But it sometimes prevents repetition. She looked away, adjusting a stack of hymn sheets that required no such attention. Lydia was under strain, I observed it, but she refused to explain. One doesn't press in such circles. People have their burdens, indeed. He allowed a small pause to lengthen. Were UAW? Are that certain non-traditional recipients had been assisted? Traders, business owners, people of that sort? A few borderline cases, perhaps, she conceded. Lydia argued that respectability can be as precarious as poverty. There is a class of person for whom the loss of status would be more destructive than simple hunger. A philosophy with which Mr. Gorman would no doubt agree, Purbright said. He appears to have specialized in such precarious persons. On his return to the station, he found Love bent over a chart drawn in pencil on the blotter, lines and arrows connecting names like an unusually pious criminal web. "Been mapping the relationship, sir," Love explained. "Gorman's wife, Mrs. Pratt of the High Street, Mr. Hopkins the builder, all recipients. All have either London connections or dealings with the Gorman circle." "A parish of clients," Purbright remarked. "How very enterprising. And one more thing." Love pointed to a small notation. "Timothy Poole." Before he left his bank, he processed a transfer to an account in the name of Gorman Consultants. Internal memo says, "At customer's urgent request." Timing coincides with the original 3000. Purbright studied the chart, its pencil lines faint but insistent. "So," he said quietly, "Mr. Gorman knew of Timothy's difficulty not as rumor, but as transaction. One might almost suspect that he had been watching for precisely such an opportunity." The web on the blotter seemed to quiver almost perceptibly, as though some unseen spider had just registered the presence of larger prey. London, viewed from the train, presented itself as an accumulation of obligations rather than attractions. Inspector Purbright sat with the mild impatience of a man travelling not for pleasure or promotion, but for the purpose of clarifying something that ought never to have become obscure. On the seat opposite Serger, N.T. Love maintained a strained neutrality toward the passing suburbs, as though they might be later called upon as witnesses. Between them lay a slim folder marked, in Purbright's carefully unshowy hand, "Gorman, Correspondence and Transactions." Gorman and Associates occupied the first floor of a building whose classical facade had survived several changes of fashion without acquiring distinction from any of them. Inside, a faint smell of disinfectant made a brave attempt to disguise the more powerful aroma of money insufficiently laundered. The receptionist, blonde, composed, and loyally uninterested, accepted Purbright's card as though it might prove contagious. "Mr. Gorman is with a client," she said. "He should not be long." "Professional men are rarely long when the police are waiting," Purbright replied pleasantly. The receptionist, who had been trained for many eventualities, but not for dry civic humor, allowed herself only the smallest pause before telephoning through. Within minutes they were shown into an inner office arranged with practiced modesty. Good furniture, unremarkable pictures, and a view that revealed enough London to confirm the address without yielding anything picturesque. Felix Gorman rose from behind a desk of dark wood and confident dimensions. His suit was discreetly expensive, his tan the particular shade acquired in climates associated more often with other people's tax liabilities. He shook hands with cordial firmness, the gesture of a man who preferred to appear entirely at ease until there was no practical advantage in doing so. "Inspector Purbright, is it? And Sergeant Love. I do hope we can clear up whatever misunderstanding has arisen." "We shall make the attempt," Purbright said. "Our provincial misunderstandings can be remarkably persistent." Gorman indicated chairs with professional hospitality. "This concerns the late Mrs. Lady. A Carstone, I take it. A most regrettable business. Her death was quite a shock." "Death," Purbright agreed, taking his seat, "often comes as a surprise to those not immediately involved." Gorman's smile thinned a fraction. "She was one of our more conscientious clients, very anxious that the fund's resources be properly invested. Charitable work requires such care." Love, who had obtained permission to appear mildly dense, tilted his head. "Invested, sir? Our impression was that the snow fund paid out coal and blankets, not dividends." "There is such a thing as sound stewardship, Sergeant," Gorman replied. "Future needs to be anticipated." "Quite," said Purbright. "We have in fact been anticipating several of them. Your telephone calls to Mrs. Carstone, for example. 17 conversations in 6 weeks. That suggests either a reckless volatility in the coal market or a subject of some delicacy." "This is all in my client files," Gorman said easily. "You are, of course, welcome to view the relevant entries through proper channels." Purbright opened the folder with the thoughtful air of a man revisiting an unimpressive playbill. "We are more interested in certain other files. The Worthing Widows Fund, the Cheltenham Children's Relief Society, the Dorset Almshouse Trust. Institutions with which you appear to have enjoyed brief but memorable relationships." Gorman's fingers, resting on the desk blotter, stiffened by no more than a millimeter. "I advise a number of charitable bodies. Some encounter difficulties. It is an unfortunate feature of underqualified management. Underqualified, Purbright repeated mildly, yet curiously well qualified for nervous collapse, sudden emigration, and, in one case, the sale of a house at considerable loss, all following your period of consultation. I am sure the pattern has occurred to you. Gorman rose and moved to the window assuming the position of a man trying not to appear cornered while testing the walls. Inspector, if you are accusing me of anything, perhaps you would be so good as to specify it. I am a busy man. Blackmail, Love said helpfully, then appeared faintly surprised by his own boldness. Gorman turned slowly, as if wary of disturbing an invisible audience. That is a very ugly word, Sergeant, and quite inapplicable. I have on occasion been made aware of mismanagement. I have occasionally advised those at fault on how to regularize matters. For a fee. It is a professional service, not extortion. A service, Purbright said, which includes identifying an administrator's weakest point, confirming it through external information, and then proposing arrangements which, though voluntary, become increasingly difficult to decline. Would that be a fair description? People who mishandle funds are often desperate for guidance, Gorman replied. If they prefer to interpret advice as pressure, that is hardly my responsibility. Purbright considered him with polite interest. Let us speak then of guidance. You were aware, for example, that the Reverend Poole's son had experienced certain banking difficulties. Gorman's eyes narrowed. If you know that, Inspector, you also know it was never a matter for criminal proceedings. Quite. Yet the information would have been useful when addressing Mrs. Carstone, who had borrowed snow fund money to rescue the young man. You could, for instance, have suggested that any investigation into her accounts might also uncover his past, that the authorities, understandably suspicious, would not greatly trouble themselves over subtle distinctions between irregularity and fraud. Gorman returned to his chair with the air of someone deciding that sitting losing ground was preferable to standing losing balance. She was in a position which required careful handling. I offered to assist her in containing the problem. She agreed. Payments were made. Nobody was hurt. Except, Love ventured, Mrs. Carstone, who is dead. Gorman's shoulders moved in what might, in a less polished man, have been a shrug. Her medical condition predated any involvement of mine. I did not prescribe her tablets. I did not push her into the snow. No, said Purbright. You merely ensured she remained precisely where she was, while the pressure increased. Blackmail, Mr. Gorman, does not require violence. It simply requires that the victim be allowed no tolerable avenue of escape. He closed the folder. There is another detail. The 3 hardship payments from the snow fund to your wife, Mrs. Celia Gorman, endorsed by her, deposited into an account for Gorman Consultants Limited. The chronology is rather clear. Gorman spread his hands. We arranged for her to test the fund's procedures. Mystery shopper, you might say. I was concerned about their controls. In that respect, Purbright said, you can hardly complain of disappointment. A silence followed, in which the office seemed to contract slightly around the 3 men. Outside, London carried on with its habitual indifference, having long ago arranged to regard such conversations as provincial curiosities. And what, Gorman asked at last, do you intend to do? As you have noted, Inspector, I have not assaulted, robbed or imprisoned anyone. Financial arrangements were agreed, not forced. Information was exchanged, not stolen. Your Crown Prosecution Service, I think, already has enough disappointment without seeking more. Purbright rose, buttoning his coat with unhurried accuracy. You are quite right. Any formal charge would require an enthusiasm for moral questions which, in my experience, the law seldom exhibits. However, there is the matter of professional organizations. Regulatory bodies, and newspapers occasionally short of material between scandals. You mean to threaten me with publicity, Gorman said, allowing a trace of distaste to show at last. I mean to inform those who believe you serve their interests, Purbright corrected. What they then conclude about the nature of your service is entirely their affair. He gave a small, almost courteous nod. One final point. When you first contacted Mrs. Carstone about the fund, how did you know she would make such an excellent subject for guidance? Gorman hesitated, and it was in that moment, barely more than a pause, that the thing revealed itself. His eyes shifted very briefly toward a drawer on the right-hand side of his desk before returning to Purbright's face. One hears things, he said, with attempted lightness. Provincial towns have very leaky walls. On the pavement outside, Sergeant Love released the breath he had evidently been holding since their arrival. "That went as well as could be expected, sir, though I don't fancy we'll see him in the dock." "No," said Purbright, "but we have seen something rather more useful." He glanced back at the window, where figures moved behind the glass like puppets practicing discretion. "That drawer he looked at when I asked how he first heard of Mrs. Carstone. If I am not mistaken, Sergeant, we have just been silently introduced to the person who showed him where to knock." Flaxborough received the news of Inspector Purbright's London excursion with the discreet avidity of a town that had long suspected the existence of metropolitan wickedness, and was gratified to learn it wore a proper suit and carried a briefcase. No formal announcement was made, yet by the following afternoon it was generally understood that Mr. Felix Gorman, financial consultant, had not emerged from his interview with reputation intact. The precise nature of his disgrace remained comfortably vague, which made it all the more serviceable. The bishop's letter arrived at the vicarage 3 days later, conveyed by the postman with the solemnity of a man delivering a small but significant bomb. Reverend Poole opened it at his study desk with the apprehensive care of someone unwrapping ordnance. The letter, couched in tactful episcopal phrasing, expressed sorrow at recent disturbing disclosures and announced the appointment of an external auditor to review all charitable funds administered under parochial auspices. Reverend Poole read the lines twice and the spaces between them 3 times. The bishop did not mention resignation, but neither did he employ any of the reassuring terms, confidence, trust, support, with which hierarchies traditionally steady wobbly subordinates. Instead, there was a suggestion that for the present, public comment would be inadvisable, a phrase which translated neatly into the vernacular as, "Do not attempt to defend yourself, it will only make matters worse." Word of the audit spread through the parish like incense on a draught, slow, pervasive, and accompanied by a certain amount of coughing. The relief committee assembled in the church hall, not now in emergency session, but in something far more unsettling, review. The trestle table bore not the usual tea urn and biscuits, but cardboard files and account books which, removed from the late Mrs. Carstone's handbag and sideboard, appeared less authoritative than they once had. Mrs. Lilling presided with the air of a woman chairing her own inquest. "This inquiry," she began, "is not, of course, a reflection upon the integrity of any individual present." The statement would have been more convincing had she not glanced at each member in turn as if quietly allocating degrees of culpability. "We are merely assisting the diocesan authorities in clarifying certain procedural oversights." "Embezzlement," murmured Colonel Gash from the back row, with the artillery directness of a man who preferred his vocabulary unsweetened. "Call a spade, madam, even if it has been used to bury something." Miss Teatime, seated beside the minute book like an underemployed court reporter, adjusted her spectacles with quiet satisfaction. "The bishop's auditor will require full transparency," she observed, "which, in our case, will entail reconstructing the transparency we so thoughtfully delegated to the late Mrs. Carstone." There was a rustle of discomfort. For years the committee had enjoyed the moral glow of charitable oversight without the inconvenience of detailed knowledge. Now, like diners compelled to inspect a kitchen, they faced the unsettling sight of ingredients they had preferred to imagine. Inspector Purbright had been invited, not officially but by that curious process through which communities persuade themselves that the police ought to be present whenever embarrassment is about to be redistributed. He sat near the wall, taking no notes, the very image of polite disinterest. This disinterestedness was sufficiently convincing that several committee members felt obliged to address him with explanations he had not requested. "We always trusted Lydia entirely," Mrs. Lilling told him in a low voice during a pause in proceedings. "One cannot run a voluntary body on suspicion, Inspector. Confidence is essential." "Indeed," Purbright agreed, "though I've noticed that confidence sometimes serves as a less laborious substitute for attention." Her mouth tightened. "We are none of us accountants." Delegation was inevitable. Mr. Bransom, the retired draper, rose to read a prepared statement in which he acknowledged that, with hindsight, certain anomalies in disbursements might have warranted further inquiry. His were. Ding suggested that, at the time, such inquiries had been postponed through that variety of delicacy which finds it impolite to question those who appear more competent. His voice faltered only once, when mentioning our late treasurer's heavy burden, a phrase that seemed to cover more than the ledgers. Outside the hall, Flaxborough digested events with its usual blend of malice and moderation. The High Street gossip network agreed on several points: that Lydia Carstone had been a bit too clever with money, that the relief committee had been a bit too grateful to be spared the trouble, and that Reverend Poole, poor man, had been well and truly done for, the exact agent of this undoing varying according to the storyteller's preference for London rogues or local weakness. The vicar, meanwhile, submitted his resignation in a letter composed with visible effort, every sentence striving to balance acknowledgement with explanation. He cited a failure of oversight in matters of administration and expressed profound regret that my deficiencies should have contributed to the strain under which our late treasurer laboured. The bishop replied with episcopal diplomacy, declining to accept the resignation while suggesting a period of reflection and reduced public profile. Flaxborough translated this as, he would remain, but not quite as before. In all this, Timothy Poole moved through the town like a man walking beside his own ghost. Those who met him on the pavement noted the slightly too careful nod, the over-punctilious greeting. The women of the Mothers' Union, passing him outside the grocer's, lowered their voices not to avoid being overheard, but to ensure that he could, if he wished, pretend not to. One or two even asked after his health with exaggerated kindness, a charity which cost nothing and implied everything. Inspector Purbright encountered him by a rang. Ement rather than accident, inviting Timothy to the station for a brief clarification of certain matters. The young man arrived punctually, dressed in a suit that had once been expensive and was now merely well kept. His hair bore evidence of repeated combing. His manner that of someone rehearsed for examinations, in which the questions persisted in changing. "I understand you have spoken with Mr. Gorman," Timothy began, preempting inquiry in the manner of those who prefer to choose their own executioner. "We have," Purbright replied. He proved surprisingly communicative when invited to describe the origin of his acquaintance with Mrs. Carstone's affairs. Timothy's smile, attempted and abandoned in the same instant, left behind a grimace. He would naturally seek to distribute blame. Self-preservation is one of his few genuine skills. Self-preservation is rarely solitary, Purbright remarked. According to Mr. Gorman, you provided him with information regarding Mrs. Carstone's use of the snow fund and suggested that her desire to avoid scandal might be leveraged, his word, for financial gain. Timothy looked down at his gloves, turning them over as though searching for a more tactful pair. "I mentioned," he said slowly, "that a certain transaction had occurred which might interest a man in his line of work. I did not anticipate the extent of his ingenuity." "You did anticipate payment," Purbright observed. "Gorman acknowledges a modest finder's fee. £50, Timothy admitted, a sum which at the time represented survival rather than venality. He paused. "I did not imagine Lydia would submit to anything beyond a single payment. She was, after all, a woman of considerable strength." "Strength," Purbright said, "can be turned quite effectively against its owner, given the proper lever." There was a long silence. Outside, the traffic light changed from red to green and back again with absolute impartiality. Eventually, Timothy spoke. "I did not intend her death, Inspector." "No," Purbright agreed. "You merely created conditions under which a frightened woman of impaired health might be steadily ground between fear and duty. The law calls that, at most, complicity in fraud. The town, however, will not limit itself to statutory terminology." Timothy's composure, maintained with increasing effort, threatened to slip. "Will there be formal charges?" "Against Gorman, possibly. Against you, unlikely. Your misconduct lies primarily in the moral rather than the criminal sphere. Our file will note your role. Whether it is ever opened in court is another question. In Flaxborough, judgment has a way of proceeding without summons." When Timothy left the station, he did so with the unconsciously careful gait of a man newly aware of the ground's potential instability. From the window, Sergeant Love watched him cross the square, shoulders drawn in as though anticipating an impact that never quite arrived. "Hard to feel sorry for him, sir," Love remarked, "though one almost does." "Pity is rarely improved by thinking about it too much," Purbright replied. His gaze, however, remained on the departing figure. Timothy hesitated at the corner, apparently undecided whether to turn toward the vicarage or the station hotel. After a brief pause, he chose neither, and walked instead toward the railway. It was an inconspicuous decision, barely noticeable from the window, yet in that slight deviation from expectation lay the faintest suggestion that Flaxborough might soon be deprived of one more parishioner, and relieved of one more conscience it had not quite known how to accommodate. The coroner's court, temporarily established in the council chamber, possessed the ceremonial gravity of a room more accustomed to debating refuse collection than mortality. On this particular morning, however, the dust on the aldermanic portrait seemed to have settled in more judicial fashion, and the municipal clock ticked with an exaggerated sense of occasion. The inquest into the death of Mrs. Lydia Carstone attracted a respectable audience, composed largely of those whose interest in civic processes increased in direct proportion to their distance from responsibility. The Parish Relief Committee were present in a body, arranged along the back bench with the muted solemnity of a choir awaiting an unfamiliar anthem. Miss Cynthia Carstone sat alone, more upright than bereaved, her black attire suggesting not so much grief as continued negotiation with the consequences of someone else's life. Dr. Hilliard, summoned to the witness table, delivered his evidence with the dry precision of a man whose acquaintance with death had long ago ceased to be romantic. Yes, Mrs. Carstone had suffered from a chronic cardiac condition. Yes, the dosage of digitalis had been adjusted in recent weeks in response to increased arrhythmia. Yes, the stress of sustained emotional disturbance would have placed considerable strain upon an already compromised heart. "Would you say, Doctor," the coroner inquired, polishing his spectacles to a judicial gleam, "that her death was, medically speaking, inevitable?" "In the abstract, all deaths are inevitable, sir," Hilliard replied. "In the concrete, this particular one was somewhat hastened. But there was no poison, no physical trauma, no evidence of external interference in the strictly physiological sense." The phrase "strictly physiological sense" drifted across the room and settled like cigarette smoke in corners where people were attempting not to think too actively. Inspector Purbright, occupying a seat that offered a clear view of both witnesses and audience, wrote nothing down. His notebook remained open, his pencil idle. The facts, such as they were, had long since arranged themselves. Miss Carstone, when called, spoke without visible tremor. Her answers were short, accurate, and conspicuously devoid of embroidery. Yes, her sister had been under strain. No, she had never named the person applying it. Yes, there had been telephone calls. No, she had not overheard their content. The unfinished letter to the bishop was produced, glanced at without enthusiasm, and placed among the exhibits with the faint disdain reserved for documents that complicated without conclusively assisting. Reverend Poole's evidence was offered in the constrained tones of a man who had rehearsed more elaborate confessions and been instructed not to use them. He confirmed the loan, expressed contrition, praised Lydia's misguided generosity, and avoided, with commendable discipline, any mention of Timothy's sideline in information brokerage. The coroner, sensitive to diocesan anxieties, did not pursue possible theological implications. The verdict, when it came, was as neat and bloodless as the town could have wished. Death from heart failure, the coroner pronounced, contributed to by natural disease and exacerbated by emotional stress. No evidence of criminal agency. There was a small collective exhalation, the sound of reputations re-inflating to something close to their former dimensions. No murder, merely tragedy. Tragedy was administratively simpler and, in Flaxborough, easier to forget. Outside the council chamber, the late winter sunlight had acquired a tentative warmth. People emerged in clusters, their conversation respectful, but already edging toward other topics: the bishop's visit, the future of the vicarage, the rumor that the snow fund might be replaced by a diocesan-administered winter care scheme, a title some felt lacked local flavor. Sergeant Love joined Purb right on the town hall steps. "So that's that then, sir," he observed. "All nicely tidied, as nicely as one could hope," Purbright replied. "It is a comfort to know that the law has spoken with such composure on a matter about which morality remains somewhat less articulate." Love considered this. "Still seems a bit like murder to me," he said eventually. "Just not the sort we're paid to notice." They walked back toward the station with the unhurried pace of men who had officially concluded a case, but not quite finished thinking about it. The snow that had dignified Mrs. Carstone's final procession had retreated to the gutters, where it persisted in grey, resentful heaps, reluctant to accept redundancy. Miss Teatime intercepted them near the chemist's, her minute-book handbag tucked under her arm in a manner suggesting that confidentiality was a portable condition. "The committee is forming a subgroup," she announced without preamble, "to consider future arrangements for seasonal relief." "How enterprising," Purbright murmured. "And will this subgroup possess more eyes than hands, Miss Teatime?" She smiled faintly. "It will possess minutes, Inspector, which is at least a start." At the station, paperwork awaited them with civic patience. Love set about producing a final report for county headquarters, carefully arranging phrases so that what they did not say would be as clear as what they did. Purbright, by contrast, wrote his summary with deceptive brevity, a series of facts connected by the thinnest of inferences, leaving ample room for any reader who preferred not to perceive implication. In the late afternoon he walked, without particular intention, toward the row of small houses where the Carstone cottage stood. The snow had gone from its small front garden, revealing flower beds of disciplined emptiness. Miss Carstone answered his knock promptly, as though callers at awkward hours were now a routine matter. "Inspector," she said, standing aside with formal courtesy. "I assume you bring conclusion rather than further inquiry." "Conclusion of a sort," he agreed. "The coroner has granted Flaxborough the gift of a natural death." "A generous man," she replied. In the sitting room, the array of medicine bottles had been removed from the sideboard. Their absence suggested not healing but the end of treatment. They spoke briefly about practicalities, the closing of accounts, the disposition of papers, the minor adjustments by which a life was administratively erased. Miss Carstone listened with the attention of someone taking delivery of furniture not entirely to her taste. "You will remain in Flaxborough?" Purbright asked, rising to go. "For the moment," she said. "Someone must remember Lydia as more than a problem to be solved." At the door she paused. "There is one thing I ought to mention, Inspector. After the inquest I went through Lydia's desk again. I thought I had catalogued everything, but there was a key taped beneath the drawer. It doesn't fit any lock in the house. Bank deposit box perhaps," Purbright suggested. "Possibly. Or simply something she intended and never accomplished. I considered throwing it away." She studied the small piece of metal lying in her palm. "But I find I am not quite ready to let her secrets go, even now." Purbright regarded the key for a moment. Unremarkable, unlabeled, and entirely out of place in a house where everything had been catalogued in triplicate. A small, mute suggestion that even exhaustive investigation rarely caught the full measure of a life. "If you should discover what it opens," he said, "you know where to find me." Walking back through streets that had almost recovered their usual indifference, he reflected that the case had ended as such matters generally did in Flaxborough, with no villains officially identified, no heroic gestures rewarded, and everyone slightly diminished by what had been necessary to preserve the illusion of order. The snow procession would continue in some revised form, the war memorial would receive its annual wreath, and parishioners would once again kneel in orderly rows, trusting, or pretending to trust, in the reassuring solidity of their institutions. Yet somewhere, tucked into the precise darkness of a bank vault, or the back of a forgotten cupboard, there might exist one final relic of Mrs. Carstone's anxious stewardship, a document perhaps, or merely an empty box that proved nothing. The possibility was not sufficient to justify further official interest. It did, however, provide Inspector Purbright with a lingering, almost comforting doubt that even in so tidy a town as Flaxborough, not every secret could be entirely accounted for.